Good afternoon. My name is Pamela Smith. Today I'm going to be talking about the Making and Knowing Project. The title of my lecture is The Making and Knowing Project, Experiments in Teaching Lab and Digital Humanities. I'd like to start by thanking Susan Douglas, who invited me to give this paper. In this lecture, I'm going to provide an overview of the Making and Knowing Project at Columbia University. And it's really been a giant experiment in research-driven pedagogy and pedagogy-driven research. I'll tell you what that means in the course of the lecture. And I'll conclude with some thoughts about the attempt to bring hands-on work into the academy. As a historian of science, I want to start with some historical context. I want you to look closely at this painting from the early 17th century. And what do you see in it? You see a great number of specific objects and practices. You see all kinds of metalworking. First of all, you see many of the products of metalworking, such as armor, and all kinds of hammered pots, bells, so on. But you see really the main purpose or main point of this image is the processes, the process of hammering metal at a forge, of putting rims way in the background. You can see the rims being put onto cannon carriages. You can see the polishing wheels here. You can see this wonderful trip hammer, which is being used to hammer out this steel armor. This painting is evidence of the great interest and enthusiasm in the 16th and 17th centuries for the processes and the products of craftspeople. This is just, as I said, one piece of evidence for an interest in nature, natural materials, and art. And by art, I mean the work of the human hand in shaping nature. In early modern Europe, and by early modern Europe, I mean around 1400 to around 1700, we can see this interest also in the great increase in writings on technical subjects, the publication of collections of recipes, and the development of an audience for such technical writings, or as they're often called, how-to literature. From about 1400, many types of craftspeople began to write down their techniques. Before this, books of practice, such as what I'm showing here, a mining book on the left and a book of distillation and medicine on the right. These technical writings, or how-to books, from about 1400 were very important in early modern Europe, because around 1400, many types of craftspeople began to write down their techniques. Before this, most books of practice were almost exclusively written by individuals from the scholarly world. In contrast, around 1400, artisans themselves took up the pen, including painters, gunpowder makers, ship's pilots, fortification builders, and dancing masters, among many others. Their writing signaled, they all practiced what were called the mechanical arts, working with their hands to produce objects and make a livelihood. Their writing signaled a departure from the traditional conception of authorship as a part of the liberal arts. And by liberal arts, that means the arts of the homo liber, the financially independent and well-born free citizen, that is, arts that were suitable to that person. The mechanical arts were viewed as manual work done under the necessity of the disfiguring business of making a living. Moreover, the texts of manual workers often contained little else than recipes, a form of codifying knowledge derived from experience that was alien to the learned culture of university scholars. By the mid-16th century, a huge number of such books were being printed in many different languages, vernacular and Latin alike. And they seem to have sold well for printers, and an audience had developed who bought the texts by around 1600. Interestingly, at the same time that more and more technical writings appeared, the artisans authoring them claimed repeatedly that their writings could not convey their knowledge fully. They insisted on the difficulty of writing down experience. For example, here, the best way of learning to draw well is to be taught by a good artist that is able to direct you. And this is Nicholas Hilliard, who was an expert craftsperson of portrait miniatures, as you see here, this tiny little portrait miniature, which is really just a few inches tall. Here is an example by Leonardo da Vinci in his drawings of dissections of the human body. He says, the more minutely you describe it, the more you will confound the mind of the reader. And so in writing down experience, artisans were articulating a very particular feature of practical or experiential knowledge. It is difficult to write down experience because descriptions become very complicated. Additionally, the craftsperson must respond to the changing conditions of the materials and workshop environments in real time. And what Leonardo da Vinci is saying here is that the more you try to describe all of the steps and all of the things that you observe, the more complicated it becomes, the more convoluted it becomes. And therefore, he's actually saying you should picture them. But artisans in general were saying you simply can't write down all of those steps. Interestingly, this is something that is also typical of the laboratory procedures in the natural sciences. And this has led to the creation of this online journal of visualized experiments in order to train and replicate more efficiently in the laboratory. So over the last 6 years, since I founded the Making and Knowing project in 2014, I've been focused on these kinds of how-to texts in order to reconstruct the practical knowledge of artisans. This knowledge was not just about techniques and materials, although it's of course also that, for how to make and do things, but it's also conceptual and theoretical. So over the last 6 years, the Making and Knowing project has focused on making and knowing as represented in this text. This is a text, a 16th century manuscript, how-to manuscript. We have just published a digital critical edition of this text. I'll give you the website at the end of the lecture, or you actually have it in the program materials. The whole project of transcribing, translating, and annotating this manuscript has been a great opportunity for interdisciplinary investigation that brings together art, science, and the humanities. The remainder of my lecture will discuss the project's findings about artisanal knowledge and its historical relationship to the scientific revolution. And I'll lay out some of the challenges and benefits of trying to interject hands-on exposure to materials and techniques into the higher education curriculum. So I'm going to start with the manuscript. MS-FR 640, held by the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, is an anonymous 170 folio or 340 page French manuscript from the late 16th century that contains all kinds of notes, instructions, and observations on procedures. Almost a third of it is on metal casting, but many, many other types of art objects. It contains much evidence of firsthand experience and experimenting, and in that it is comparable to Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks from about 50 years previous. It's an invaluable source for studying artisanal knowledge and techniques. I want to give you an overview of the manuscript's contents. These are categories that the Making and Knowing project assigned to all of the over 900 entries or recipes in the manuscript. These are not linear recipes. These are observations, notes, very recipes or sets of instructions that only include part of a process. Sometimes that process is continued later on in the in the manuscript, sometimes many pages, before or after, wherever there was room. So it's quite messy. It's not just a very linear or straightforward book of recipes. In any case, the Making and Knowing Project classified all of these over 900 entries or recipes into these 26 categories you can see here. And you can see that casting takes up about almost a third, or a little more than a third, of the manuscript. Painting is the next largest one, 15%, 14%. Metal processes. So, if this is an artisan, which it seems like it probably is, then, it probably was he, and I must be, we think, male, the anonymous author, was a founder or metalsmith of some sort. So the objects that were the aim of these recipes in this manuscript would have been collected together in the 16th century in what is called a Kunstkammer, a chamber of art. These were collections of natural and artificial, that is, human-made things. And such collections were intended to spark conversations on the relationship of the artifice of nature and the artifice of the human hand. They were evidence of a new interest in the relationship between nature and human art, and in the power of practical knowledge. How this manuscript came into being is still a mystery, a very intriguing one, and who composed it is another intriguing question. But it is clear that it was composed in Toulouse, in southern France, in 1580 or after 1580, and it belonged in 1662 to Philippe de Béthune, an old noble at the courts of two kings of France, who was an art collector. And you can see here his portrait on the right. He was an art collector of such artworks by Caravaggio. This one was recently rediscovered in a French church. It's marked here with the Béthune coat of arms, the same one that you see on the outside of the cover of the book. And what this shows is that Philippe was interested in art, and perhaps he commissioned this manuscript from a metal worker, or perhaps he bought the manuscript from a very ambitious artist. So over the last 6 years, the aims of the Making and Knowing Project have been, as I said, to do research on craft making and scientific knowing for the digital critical edition, which has just appeared in earlier this spring. But more generally, the Making and Knowing Project explores the intersections of craft making and scientific knowing, as well as attempting to bring hands-on work into history and the humanities. Our research has been carried out in libraries, archives, museums, and most of all, or most unusually perhaps, in the laboratory. So that we do text, object, and laboratory-based research on this how-to manuscript. I'm going to tell you now the 4 stages of our research, the pedagogical project, and then I'll turn to our research results. So this is the project. This is a, it shows you quickly the edition, but you can go online and look at it yourself. So you can see this is the pages. If you click on one of the thumbnails, you get the transcription. You can also, there's a normalized transcription, there's a translation. You can see that it's laid out pretty much the same as the manuscript. And there you just saw one of the commentary essays. There is all the TEI encoding. So you see that there are a lot of resources to hand with this edition. Then we had students mostly students write essays. There are about 128 essays that discuss and analyze the different entries in the manuscript. It's very extensive critical commentary, and most of it was, as I said, written by students in regularly scheduled lab seminars. And that's what I'm showing you here is an example of one of the essays that was written. Okay, so let me tell you about the 4 components from 2014 to 2019. And this is really just the first project that we're doing as the Making Knowing project. Okay, so text workshops, graduate lab seminars, working group meetings, and digital development. So first, the text workshops. The text workshops were intensive training in transcribing, editing, interpreting, translating, and marking up the manuscript. We had between 2014 and 2018, we had 8 text workshops, summer workshops. Mark Smith, who you see there in the center at the top, was the paleography lead. And graduate students they applied to these seminars, and they produced the transcription and translation of the manuscript as they learned the skills of paleography, TEI markup, and group translation. The second component was the 8 graduate lab seminars. They were semester-long seminars that researched and reconstructed the recipes in the manuscript, and in which students wrote essays that now form the critical apparatus of the edition. So this was a lab course, and that meant that we needed to really do extensive skill building at the beginning of the semester, because the students were mainly from the social sciences and humanities and had little, or really most of them had no lab experience at all. So I just want to note here that we are preparing an open access research and teaching companion to the edition that will go live next year, although components of it are ready now and we're piloting them with classes we did the last semester. So this research and teaching companion will include lesson plans for incorporating making and hands-on skill building at every level of education. So some of the skill building that's included in that research and teaching companion and that we've done over the past 6 years have been the historical culinary recipe reconstruction. We begin with this. This is a wonderful exercise to make the students think about interpreting a text and actually carrying out the instructions in it in a modern setting. It's a wonderful community building exercise to start with, and I can tell you more about it at the end if people have questions. Second, we then turn to the manuscript itself, and this is one of the recipes from the manuscript in which you can make a bread mold, a mold from bread. So the students first learn to bake bread. They have to learn how to cook 16th century bread from a sourdough starter that I give them. And then they bring it into the lab and we pour it with the variety of materials that the author practitioner, as we call the anonymous author of this manuscript, discusses. It's cuttlefish casting, very ancient technique still used by goldsmiths today, very easy to introduce students to the process of mold making. This is verdigris growing. We give them the copper and the jar and the vinegar at the beginning of the semester. They grow it all semester. They bring it in and we paint it out at the end of the semester. This is red lake making so that we can train them in the difference between a pigment and or rather a dye and a pigment. So out of this skill building and the students identify a topic, and We usually bring in an expert maker during the semester for a couple of weeks, and they help the students. They help with the skill building, and they help the students think about the resources that they'll need in doing their research. So the students in the lab course wrote concentrated research essays that describe and explain the manuscript's recipes and provide insights and raise questions about practical and artisanal knowledge. What you're seeing here is the essays page of all the thumbnails of the essays in the edition. That's what you'll see when you go to look at it. But just to look more closely, you can see the kinds of things that they wrote on. And the numbers, folio 10R, are the page or folio numbers. And so you can see just the variety of things that there are in the manuscript. Molding a rose, wax and tallow, sulfur, oxbone and rock salt, powder for hourglasses, and so on and so forth, sugar casting. So that was actually the metalworking and mold making year, the first year. The second year, we gathered together the recipes for color making in the manuscript. We always had to focus on one theme, otherwise we couldn't do the skill building for the students and bring in an expert maker. So it was very important to pick a theme. So again, you can see the variety of kinds of recipes there are in the manuscript. This was vernacular natural history, practical perspectives, optics and medicine, the third year. There are about 40 medical recipes in the manuscript, and the students have reconstructed most of them, I would say. These are some of the objects that we've made, or the students have made, that they've reconstructed, that are now in our lab. And then the third component of the project, or to transcribe and translate this digital critical edition, were the annual working group meetings. So at the end of each year, we would bring in scholars who were experts in the theme from that year. We'd bring them together with the lab class students, and the scholars would give lectures that gave us more insight and information on the theme of the year. But very importantly, they were assigned to certain students' essays, and they really provided the critical oversight over the student work, which was very important for the reliability and the sophistication of the edition and the critical commentary on it. The fourth component of the project was digital development and the prototyping and development of the edition. And you can see that we did a lot of, our markup makes possible a lot of analysis of the manuscript. And here we have actually categorized, we have tags, we have 26 tags. No, we have 26 categories and 14 tags. The 14 tags include what you see here: materials, tools, plants, animals, coins, musical instruments, and you can see just the instances. This is simply a word count of the frequency of the terms within each of these tag sets. We also looked into the geographic imaginary of the manuscript by mapping the imaginary of processes and materials. That is, when there is a city name or a place name mentioned within the recipe, we tag that as place name, and of course with the tagging can correlate it to the 26 categories. So alchemy, arms and armor, casting, and so on. There is only one alchemical recipe in the manuscript, by the way. Okay, I want to turn now to insights that we've gained from this research. And I would say that they fall into three categories: embodied experience, artisanal knowledge, and then I want to make some comments about the pedagogical value of reconstruction and the research value of reconstruction. So in the first year, the students were very confused and repeatedly questioned, how do we know how much to add of the wine and elm root liquid to the molding material, the sand, as the author practitioner calls it, for sand molding. There aren't any quantities, or there are a few in certain recipes, but not very many. But the students soon learned that they needed to look for consistency statements, such as, then apply a thick coat, as thick as mustard or a little thicker, over the metal. And there's repeated reference to the consistency of mustard. Now, interestingly, there's also a mustard recipe in the manuscript. So that we also reconstructed, which you can see the photos from that here. But we realized that these are sensory tools that were necessary at the time, because of course laboratories were not, or rather workshops were not the hermetically sealed laboratories of today. They were places often open to the air. Materials were not standardized, so you could not include quantities, because of course the dryness of the flour or the type of seed might differ in different places. So what you do is you talk about consistency, and that was very telling for the students. We really realized the importance of statements such as, the sand should give a nice hold but still come apart easily. And this is something that we came to refer to as the squeeze test for mold making. There was also the paper test, which is the way that temperature was measured. The temperature of a metal was measured before thermometers. And here we're using paper from the Iowa Paper Project that they generously gave us. It's reconstructed late 16th, early 17th century paper. So if you read how-to manuals from this period or how-to literature from this period, you'll find that there are many different kinds of tests to test heat. So again, the sensory tool of embodied experience. Similarly, we came to appreciate the importance of qualitative instead of quantitative statements in the manuscript. And here, this is the author practitioner is really pursuing this impalpability. He wants this sand, this casting material, to be impalpable. And we realized that this was a technical term that was used in English, French, and Italian at the time, impalpable. And here, interestingly, you see the firsthand experience, but you also see that he defined what impalpability was. I crushed it on a porphyry slab, until it is fine enough to slip through your fingers without being felt. We see that there are many traces of investigation and experiment in this manuscript. He often has in the margin, try this. Here he says, try burnt oysters. The students experimented with that. So the point that we realized here is that any making process necessitates a great deal of experimentation. Trying, reflecting, extending, sometimes failing, doing something a new way. And you really see this so clearly in this manuscript in the many, many trials of materials for casting. The author practitioner of this manuscript experiments constantly. Here he does scores of experiments, which the students have reconstructed, in mixing sulfur, wax, and pigments in order to make a better modeling and molding material. Very interesting kinds of transformation of materials that he does here. Here, the author practitioner is trying to find impalpable sands for casting, and he tries many different kinds of materials: oyster shells, calcine, that is burned to an ash, alabaster burned to an ash, bone burned to an ash. In all of these processes, the author practitioner is constantly investigating the properties of materials and how to transform them from one state to another. For example, hard, brittle oyster shells, for example, into a fine, powdery, impalpable sand. Throughout the text, he is preoccupied with the native properties of materials: liquid, congealed, vaporous, malleable, brittle, and so on, and their transformation. This focus is shared by many early modern practical writings, which instruct in how to transform materials into a more workable or useful form. Such as, probably more familiar to most people than calcined materials, is the transforming of brittle iron into malleable steel. And what this really represents is a constant material investigation into transformation, which is common to any workshop. And this constant material investigation and into transformation of materials is a way to hypothesize about what materials and processes work. And in doing this, the practitioner forms taxonomies of materials and ways of processing them. And you can see this emerging in the manuscript. And what this investigation into transformation of materials does is to really reveal the underlying forms and properties of things. The author practitioner is looking for patterns, very much like any scientist today. One example of the systematized material knowledge in the manuscript is the system of categories used by the author practitioner and other metalworkers. He uses Aristotelian categories of cold, wet, hot, and dry, but even more prevalent in his metalworking recipes, or actually in many different kinds of recipes, is the opposition between fat and lean and sour and sweet. And these two formed a set of underlying principles that structured practices. So some sands were lean and arid, some sands were fatty, some metals were fatty, and basically the underlying principle was you had to bring these things into balance. It was the underlying principle of natural philosophy, it was the underlying principle of artisanal work, it was the underlying structuring paradigm of health as well in the early modern period. In many of the processes, and in art more generally, raw materials are processed and pushed beyond their native properties in order to take on or to imitate the characteristics and appearances of other substances. There are many imitation recipes in the manuscript, and it's important as a mode of work of material transformation. For example, here, making imitation emeralds from ground quartz, red lead, and other materials to imitate green emeralds on the right. There are several recipes in the manuscript for imitating precious stones, and you can see that the material transformation is particularly marked here, from this red, orange, red lead to the green copper, green emerald, excuse me. The manuscript contains instructions for imitation of all kinds, for example, imitation marble, imitation glass, rouge clair, it's imitation glass, red glass, but it's actually in resin or in oil. There is also in the manuscript imitation of optical effects, for example, of red wine into white, or imitating the particularity of flesh tones in women versus men. There is also a recipe in the manuscript for imitation jasper, and this is a type of stone. You can see the natural stone in the center there. And this is important because a 16th century writing artisan, Bernard Palissy, claimed to imitate natural processes that took place in the earth in his making of imitation jasper ceramics. Now, this is not ceramics what the author practitioner is doing. And the author practitioner does not make those kinds of natural philosophical claims in his humbler book of recipes. But he is nevertheless engaged in the same investigation and experimentation as Palissy. And so I see this as a very good example of the intersection between making and theorizing about the ways in which rocks and minerals are formed in the earth. So you can see an intersection between the vernacular doing and the, we could call it the university textual theorizing about how processes happen in the earth. The connection between making and theorizing in natural history can be seen in the preoccupation on the part of the author practitioner with imitating and preserving the lifelikeness of ephemeral living things by transforming materials. So here he's transforming these ephemeral things, a rose, a beetle, by life casting into metal. He's fixing these ephemeral things in metal. And here is an example of what I would call vernacular natural history. So the manuscript contains much on the catching, feeding, keeping, and killing, and then molding and arranging of reptiles. It is in the life casting. It is for the purpose of life casting. It's in the life casting recipes in this manuscript. And it's those techniques of keeping animals and the observation of animals' characteristics and how they behave and where they feed and where you can catch them, that is vernacular natural history. Now, it's very unusual for this kind of knowledge actually to be codified in a manuscript. So this is there's no other manuscript which contains these kinds of descriptions of animal behavior at this time, and the use of animals in this way. So it's quite remarkable, but it does show us just how the artisanal vernacular natural history, that sort of intersection with textual natural history, necessitated the same kind of observation, and the same, actually contributed in many ways to the natural history that then you see in texts produced by university scholars. You can also see this interest in preserving lifelikeness, in the interest in understanding the lifelikeness and the characteristics of living things in his drying flowers in sand and drying animals in an oven, a kind of taxidermy, in order to preserve them. Now here, he isn't just imitating and preserving life and nature, but also playing in this recipe in which he's talking about this method of taxidermy, animals dried in an oven, and he gives the instructions for how to do it. And then he says, one can add a painted tongue or horns or wings or anything you may imagine. So the Making and Knowing Project reconstructed this method of taxidermy, and then a professional taxidermist put wings onto our rats. So this is about not just imitating nature, obviously, but also playing on how the human hand can alter and transform nature. And this was the aim of a Kunstkammer, of the art chamber. Such hybrid animals were often included in the art chamber. So this is another example of the way in which this manuscript is about the relationship between nature and art. And you find many artisans and craftspeople writing this, considering this relationship in their texts. Now I want to conclude briefly by discussing the value of making and knowing in research and teaching. So the first example that I want to show you is really shows how reconstruction is an important technique for coming to understand the material dimensions of processes and practices. So this is my first example. It's on 103R, folio 103R of the manuscript. It's one of the few recipes for medicines in the manuscript. There are about 40 of them. And this is a salve for burns. It just says against burns, excellent. This recipe is unusual in the manuscript for two reasons. First, because it is a medical recipe. There are only a few of them. And second, because it has it seems to have an explicitly religious dimension, which includes saying the Our Father prayer, the Pater Noster, and stirring with holy water. Using the paternoster as a means of time measurement is actually very common in artisanal workshops in the early modern period. But if you're reading along here very quickly, you will notice that you first say 9 and then 8 and then so on down to 1. So you're stirring and saying the paternoster, then you're dumping out the holy water, putting in some more, stirring, saying the paternoster. So as we intoned the 45 paternosters and we stirred, this mixture of linseed oil and beeswax, which you see as a kind of partially runny yellow liquid up on the left, underwent a spectacular inspiriting into a pure white fluffy material, increasing in volume by about 5 times. Now, recreating this recipe made us realize the material dimension to this religious ritual. We saw how making could be worshiping or devotion. It resulted in an ennobled, inspirited, and apparently, according to the author practitioner, efficacious product. We would never have understood this text and what it actually did without the process of reconstructing it. So it helps us to read texts. Here's my second example, and that is, as I mentioned before, coming to understand the importance of descriptions of consistency in the manuscript. Now, looking back on it, this is pretty self-evident, but it took actually reconstructing to understand the full import of why qualitative statements are more important than quantities in a world where materials don't arrive in the lab in standardized form, and where the workshop is open to the damp, open to the heat, and therefore materials will behave differently. Another value of reconstruction in the classroom is, in the historical classroom, is the value of learning through failure. And the students absolutely failed in their first pour. And it sent the students back to the text again to really look closely at the manuscript. They were very discouraged to begin with, but they went back to it. And that kind of training of persistence and looking for new ways to interpret something is a very important skill, I think. Another value, pedagogical value of reconstruction is the collaboration and iteration of the recipes. This very much helped in our research. So at Columbia, the students made many attempts to do a particular process on medal making, medallion making, as you see here. They were not terribly successful. They did achieve proof of concept. But then our collaborators in Amsterdam, at the University of Amsterdam, who were working with us that year, built on their work and were able to produce something, also taking many trials, but they were able to actually succeed in doing this method of this process of casting a medallion. Another value of this kind of work is, and maybe it's the most important one actually, is the new questions that it raises about the material world and human interaction with it. And here we have a powder for hourglasses, which seemed like an entirely implausible recipe, as many of them do in the manuscript. It worked very well, and we learned a lot about hourglasses and all kinds of very interesting, actually, chemical and physical requirements of hourglass sand. But it especially raised questions about the production chain in early modern Europe for hourglasses, which were ubiquitous items, but no one has ever thought to ask about how they were made or where they came from. There's very little scholarship on many of the processes and this kind of material history that we're doing among historians. So you really learn a lot about the past. You learn even about our present kind of categories of understanding of the material world. Okay, finally, I want to conclude with pedagogy. And I said at the beginning that this was pedagogy-driven research and research-driven pedagogy. Now, I think, we were able to do a fully um, commented upon and annotated digital critical edition, which meant transcription, translation, and huge amount of work to comment on the recipes. And in actually a very short time, in 5 years. In the last year, we've just been editing the edition. And I think that the success of it is because of the manuscript. It's a substantive, intriguing object of research for everybody. It involves active exploration by instructors and students in the research. I mean, we're not experts in any of these, the instructors, that is me and my postdocs. We're not experts in any of these processes. And so we are exploring along with the students. Now, we try and stay ahead of them, we learn, we talk to the expert makers, etc. But it's just an incredible exploration every year. Next, I think that because we have a kind of apprenticeship model of learning, and this really emerged out of the very intensive work that was going on. So we have people of different skill levels, different backgrounds in the lab, and they really learn from each other. If there are students who are more experienced in something, or they've been there for, some of them took the lab course twice, they've been there for another year. Even the fact that we did the skill building over and over again meant that we actually had accumulated knowledge within both the instructors, but also within the lab setting itself. And you all know that if a student can teach another student, it's really both consolidates the information and the knowledge both in the mentor and the apprentice. So it was just a wonderful thing that developed, and the students loved sharing what they knew and their successes. So there's a lot of sharing of knowledge and expertise. There's a lot of skill building. We gave a lot of thought to the first half of the semester, really, which is almost totally devoted to skill building. It also turned out that there was a real iterative design to this project. I hadn't really, well, it wasn't a design, it emerged out of the process. And what I mean by that in terms of iterative design is that we had students of French who worked on, who wanted to learn French paleography, were already expert in French, language. And so they would transcribe and translate the manuscript of the recipes for that particular year. And then the lab course students would do research on those recipes. They would actually get insight, which would inform the translation or inform our understanding of the meaning of this process and the what exactly the process involved. Then we would have those essays looked over by scholars who were experts in that area. And the students would have to go back and work on their essays again. And then we had a really very intensive editing campaign by myself and the postdocs of these student essays, sometimes in collaboration or in consultation with the expert makers and the scholars who would come for the working group meeting. So there was a real kind of loops, feedback loops and loops of work. And everything was looked over many, many times. But it does mean that over the course of the 6 years, there was a great deal of accumulation of knowledge from year to year. So, that focus on the single object of research, which everybody became so invested in, this fascinating manuscript, was really an important part of the pedagogical success, I think, of the research. And I would, I think it's really something, a model for, that I will certainly use in the future. Okay, this is a lot of information here, but I just wanted to say that hands-on learning really helped us in many ways. I've talked about, the ways that it helped us in insights into research on the manuscript. But in addition to that, I think that it fosters close reading of historical documents. It trains people's attention on, this is a particular kind of document that we're talking about. It's a how-to text, but I do think that it really instills in the students the importance of really attentive reading. It develops habits of close observation of materials and processes, that is the hands-on work. They begin to develop hand skills, dexterity, bodily familiarity with process. It gave them great insight into embodied forms of knowledge, as I've shown you in this lecture. These very accomplished graduate students at Columbia learned the value of learning through failure. These are students who have tried never to fail in their lifetimes, have pretty much succeeded, and many of them were afraid to do things the first time, but they really learned that you could fail and just kind of carry on. And in fact, it's a necessary part of experiential knowledge. And it really helps you, this trial of failure, repetition, extension into new areas, helps you really think about how to adapt to unexpected outcomes. As I said, reconstruction alerts us to unsuspected materials and techniques, and it raises questions that would otherwise go unasked. I've talked about the apprenticeship model, the peer teaching, which of course, as I said, increases understanding and retention of knowledge by both the mentor and apprentice. The collaboration and crowdsourcing, or it was really grad sourcing, expert crowdsourcing, was a revelation to me as a historian who had always worked alone. And it was incredibly efficient. Hard to set up, intensive, all-consuming, but very efficient for doing research. The success, again, is the project-based group learning, I think. I mean, that was very powerful. I think that this interdisciplinary approach that we had to adopt for this kind of manuscript really broke down intellectual hierarchies between the sciences and the humanities. It opened science to many of the students who, had gone into the humanities or into history because they thought they were no good at science. And for the science students, we had a few undergraduate science students, it really opened the history of their discipline to them, the history of the natural sciences and the humanities to them. So it was a very good kind of crossover, interdisciplinary crossover. So how can we really scale and expand this kind of research to all demographics and all levels of learners? And we're trying to think about that in the Research and Teaching Companion. We are thinking about, what if you have a lab? What if you have a studio? What if you just have a classroom? What do you need to do this kind of research? How can it be built into classes which are not actually researching and how-to manual? And I think that it's a kind of pedagogy which stresses the importance of other ways of knowing, that is the knowing that comes out of making, out of experimentation, out of hand skills, out of collaboration. And I think that this might validate alternative paths of education and training. Some students are just, this would be the way to really learn for them, is hands-on, really active learning. So, I think, because that's what I know is higher education. And so I think a lot about what academics can do in higher education. And I think in some ways, university learning is probably most resistant to hands-on approaches in the humanities. So what can we do? Well, one thing is, if you can't actually get into a lab, you can integrate making and makers and maker advocates into conferences, into events, into your classroom, who can bring in, demonstrate, give students the opportunities to try, for example, here, weaving. We put on at the Center for Science and Society, which I founded and am the director of, in 2017, we put on a conference on weaving and cognition. We brought in weavers, weaving advocates, some of whom you see here, and we also had opportunities for attendees to practice weaving. You can also integrate, you can create training opportunities. If you can't do a course that incorporates making, you could lead a workshop that introduces students to the life world of craftspeople. And this was a 2014 course in Chiang Mai on craft and heritage, craft heritage, that was put on by the International Institute for Asian Studies in Leiden in the Netherlands. We had students work for one day in traditional workshops and then report on it to the class. Now, we were very lucky that we could go to Thailand, to Chiang Mai, where there are many, many workshops, traditional workshops. But I think you don't need to do this. You don't need to go, to Thailand to do it. I think there are probably many opportunities that could be found to observe the life world of a making process and take part in it. That's the important thing, is for the students to take part in it. In 2017 and 2019, I organized a 14-day workshop that immersed PhD students in the life world of weaving in Chiang Mai, again in a traditional workshop. And while the students all report that it really changed the way in which they conceptualize knowledge, the way that they're approaching their dissertations, we have to wait and see until they're into their careers and into their lives after their PhDs to see what difference it makes in terms of their pedagogy, in terms of how they think about their subjects of research, and how they can carry on the making that they did there into the classroom. So we have to really stay tuned to see what difference this kind of work makes. I think I can already see the Making and Knowing project activities have made a difference for the students who have finished their dissertations. Many of them are thinking about kind of alternative, not going into they're going into teaching, but not necessarily into university teaching. And one of my students, who's at a private high school in New York, actually is teaching European history through making practices. The students absolutely love it. So I think that there are a lot of possibilities. I want to just end by, whoops, went the wrong way. Acknowledging the core members of the Making and Knowing project, especially the 9 postdoctoral scholars with whom I had the real great privilege of working over the last 6 years in different cohorts, and core members of the Making and Knowing team, Terry Catapano, the digital lead, Mark Smith, the paleography lead, Naomi Rosenkrantz, the assistant director, and Caroline Sermon. And many, many other people and institutions were involved in this project, for which I am deeply, deeply grateful. And I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I hope that you can come visit us at the Making and Knowing Lab. Thank you.
We have the fascinating work of the Making and Knowing project at Columbia University. That Pamela Smith has kindly agreed to share with us. It's a tour de force of interdisciplinary thinking, of pedagogy, and it's a thrilling project.
Thank you so much, Susan. And I'm really thrilled to be here because, as I wrote in the discussion preparation, we are preparing a research and teaching companion. So you are the first group of K through 12 teachers who I've spoken to about the project in terms of the research and teaching companion. So I am very eager to hear everything that you think and have questions about. And, as I asked on the discussion preparation, whether you think that you can use this in some way in your own teaching, because I think the thing that surprised me most about the project from, you know, the first couple of weeks of teaching the lab seminar was that it was more, or not more, but equally about pedagogy as about research. And it's been just wonderful in terms of how the students, both graduate and undergraduate students, have you know, become just followers of this cult, as I call it, the Making a Knowing Project, and have really are a very tightly knit group, and it's really carried on into their further studies. So I'm very interested. I guess I'll just start with the question: how many of you took the did the scavenger hunt, and what did you come up with? Now I'm okay. Great. I see one person. Unfortunately, I can't get participants up at the same time as the gallery view.
Yeah, if you could put thumbs up or just wave your arms if you had a chance to
Yeah.
go into the website and
I
look.
saw Maureen McCarthy started, and then June Morris. Maureen, do you want to ask your question? You're muted. Yeah.
I didn't have a question. I was just going to say I did do it. I went through Rosemary and looked up some of the different things. It was fascinating.
Great, great. Yeah. What did you find that surprised you? Anything?
Well, I decided not to go with the kind of ones that sounded a little gross. So I went with Rosemary and kind of food ones that, and the Rosemary, it was more about coming up with medicines, right? Than it was about spicing up your meal.
Yeah, I'm wondering, that's exactly right. I'm wondering whether you had a chance to read the essay on smoke and silk as well, because that is the kind of principal rosemary recipe that we focused on for the student research. And this is such an interesting example of the movement of materials and of commodities around the world that you've heard about in some of the other lectures. Because this author practitioner, as we call him, the author who was also an artisan or practitioner, thought that, you know, smoking rosemary in a pipe would heal colds and all kinds of illnesses like that we now call colds. And that, you know, the pipe is, of course, from Central America, was being already manufactured in Europe by that time. So that kind of smoking technology came from the Americas, and or possibly from the East through the Ottoman Empire. So it's an interesting story of travel of materials and technologies around the world, even though it's, you know, solidly in Toulouse in southern France. Okay, so June Morris, you raised your hand. What did you do?
I just looked at the website too, and I was just really struck by all the interconnections globally, and that's something that I try to incorporate in all my teaching. And this is just a great resource. I'm hoping that I'll be able to really dig into it.
Great. Oh, I hope so. I hope your students find the manuscript, you know, useful in some way. And that's another question that I want to ask is, like, how would you use it in a class?
Yeah, I'm thinking about doing some sort of inquiry project, but I'm not totally sure yet. I'm still percolating on a lot of ideas right now. So mostly I was just really thrilled. I'd never heard of the Making a Knowing project. Thank you.
Great. Well,
we have a couple of questions lined up in the chat, but I just wanted to mention that, especially now where we're going to be teaching virtually, if we can cook up some, I'm using a pun here, if we can cook up some ways for students to do these inquiries at home, there are lots of old cookbooks that we could, you know, give them these old recipes, or you know, the kind of experiments that you can do at home. This what really, you know, liven up the day of online teaching, and then have them report back on what they did.
Right.
You know, even using substances to see how you get color out of onion skins, or, you know, experimenting with these kinds of things. We have a question.
That, actually, sorry, we did that.
Well, I love the way you lay out how to get students to do these things, because they're not used to doing the sort of inquiry, you know, toss things together and see what happens, but you had a very systematic way of having them approach it. And I'm sure that it aligns with the, what are the science standards called? The great, I've forgotten exactly the latest name for the science standards, but you can follow those principles. We actually have a new curriculum activity up on inquiry into spices and various things. And one of my colleagues who comes to a lot of our sessions has the students make carrot mummies to see what substances will preserve the carrots the best, and puts them in little sarcophagi made out of index cards. We just have that material ready to
Well,
put
let me
out.
just say that you could also do a home experiment in which they just take spices from their cupboard and try to make pigments out of them. You know, mix them with water, mix them with oil. We did that with a class. I see in the chat that the project reminded me a lot of experimental archaeology. Absolutely true. Yeah, absolutely true. I just also want to say that hands-on activities as part of history, I think that this is a great way to teach history. One of my students, former students from the Making and Knowing Project, actually is teaching K through 12. She's teaching 7th grade now. And she's teaching European history through hands-on experiments, the whole thing. So,
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that, you know, we have some resources already up on the website, the historical culinary recipe reconstruction. So that you could use those recipes, those old recipes in English. They're very confusing, but that's the point. You want the students to struggle with the text and, you know, just try it out and experiment, and nobody will know the answer, including the instructor. So it's, you know, makes it a real research object for them. More questions? Can
We
you
have
see
Teresa
okay.
Trevelock.
Great.
Unmute. Good morning. I looked at bread because I make bread, and I thought it'd be interesting to see, and I was surprised at how many different aspects of bread were used in the book. When I did my search, I'm sorry, my cat is howling. When I did this search, I didn't come up with any recipes, but bread was used as a feature, I guess, in lots of other recipes. It was used as a way of looking at the consistency of a compound. It was used to connect religion, the religious aspect of bread, to something that they were making. It was used as a almost like money, because people would be paid in bread. You know, you get your daily bread kind of thing. Galen had created a hierarchy of grains based on a healthy diet, and that all affected how you made bread and the consistency of the different breads based on Galen's hierarchy. And then when I went through some of the videos, which I thought, oh, I'm not gonna have time to look at, but anyway, one of the videos talked about using bread to mold something. And I was like, who would ever have thought that, you know, this squishy stuff would, like, so it was just really interesting. It was like everything but the recipe for bread, but all these other ways.
And that's a really good historical lesson for the students, actually, is what we do at the beginning of every semester, you know, when we have in-person semesters, is we actually give them sourdough starter, and they have to go and learn to make bread. You know, just by themselves. We tell them a little bit about how to treat their sourdough starter, but they all come back saying it's just like our pet. Yeah, but anyway, so that the point of that is for them to do research online and try and find a 16th century bread recipe, and there aren't any, because it was such a common thing that there were not recipes for it. In fact, the first recipe for bread, French bread, excellent French bread, was that was written down. I mean, obviously there were recipes, they just weren't written down. Was actually collected by a member of the Royal Society for the Advancement of Natural Knowledge in London, and that was one of the first scientific societies, founded in 1660. And John Evelyn collected a recipe for French bread and presented it to the Royal Society. So you really see the connection between artisans and the new philosophers, the new scientists of the Royal Society in that example, that they began collecting these recipes because they had no idea how actually to engage with the materials of nature, including things like bread baking. They were mostly elite, mostly trained by, texts, not by their hands. And so that's a really good example for the students of, something that was so common did not have a recipe about it, and it was actually taken up by the new scientists.
It just reminds me of two other things, and I can't remember the phrase off the top of my head, but there's a UN agency that creates international treasures, designates things like French bread, international treasure.
Yeah, UNESCO,
so
intangible cultural heritage.
Yeah.
Right, that's trying to collect and preserve these things.
Yeah.
The other use that I just read my notes again was that they used bread ovens for experimentation in other things. So the kitchen really becomes a laboratory.
Exactly. The workshop and the laboratory. That's exactly right. I mean, that's the interdisciplinary that we want to make that point over and over again. The kitchen is not very far from the workshop, is not very far from the laboratory.
And that amazing painting that you started your lecture with, just to have students go in there and see all that's going on, the use of water power. Well, we thought that was Industrial Revolution, the trip hammer, have them really like take it apart and what are they using this for and what do the workers look like and what are they wearing and on and on and on.
Yeah, that's a great image for many reasons. Yeah. More questions?
We have Linda Burns.
Great.
Well, I feel sort of silly now because when I first looked at, I also looked at bread, and what made me laugh is Maureen said that I think it was Maureen said that she was avoiding the gross things, and I I went immediately to the grossest thing that bread was used for, which was which I found really fascinating, that they were using bread not only for the things that were just discussed, but for a poultice, well, not a poultice, but like to bring down the swelling of teats. And that was the one that I just went, I mean, you guys are beginning to see a side of me I probably don't want to expose, but I was really interested in that. So, and thought that was really, and thought also, knowing my kids, that I would have kids that would just be like, that's the thing I'm interested in, is that word, and go straight to it. So that was kind of fun, I thought. And then we
have an essay on that, actually. You can read the essay.
Oh, really? Oh, I would love to read that.
Yeah, it's the medicinal plaster for swelling or whatever.
I was confused whether that was for women or whether that was for animals, or whether both.
To know. Yes, that's a good question. That's the perfect question, and we don't know. We couldn't test it out, of course, because we would have had to.
Right, exactly.
But
one of the ones that you don't get to do as an experiment.
Yeah, exactly. But
anyone who's ever had engorgement from nursing, or even when it happens to cows, that they get a block duct, it's serious stuff.
Serious, absolutely.
Serious stuff.
Yeah,
but I did actually
make the plaster. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Linda. Yeah,
I know. I was just your comment that you just made about the role of the kitchen made me sort of struck a new question for me, which is so, and you may not know the answer to this question, but I'm wondering what the role of women in these experiments were, given that the kitchen, I mean, was often a space for women, and also because I know that in these earlier periods there was a lot of, like, women were involved in their husbands workshops. And so do we know really what the role of women was in this experimentation?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that luckily there are some great books on women and recipes and women's experimentation by historians of science. I can provide you with a list of them. One of them is by Alicia Rankin, who wrote on court women and their medical recipes and just the ways in which they were obviously doing experimentation. Women were, in general, within the household, in charge of medicine and health in the household, and so all women would have done made medicines and would have done distillation. And there are many, many, many recipes in English as well. Elaine Leong, Leong, has just published a book on recipes in early modern England, which would be actually a great, it's a very accessible book. It would be a great book to extract from for your students. And she shows the way in which, you know, people did experiments over multiple generations. In, you know, there's evidence in these recipe books for that in a family, because the recipe books were kept in families in manuscript. So luckily there's a lot of information on that. I mean, you know, the women's role, the household, the larger household, in which a workshop was simply part of that whole household, meant that a woman was often even took part in the working procedures of a craftsperson's workshop. Women after you know, about 1400 could not become an official part of a guild. So of course they couldn't have a profession in that sense, but that didn't mean that they didn't actually work alongside their sons and husbands. So, you know, they didn't, as in all things, they didn't have an official role, but they certainly had a lot of work.
Before I call on Jennifer, I just wanted to comment on the gross things. Of course, our students love that stuff a lot of times.
Yeah.
But in dung and in urine, these contained powerful chemicals that could set off reactions that were, you know, quite surprising. They were used as fixatives and as, you know, all kinds of stuff. So that they were so readily accessible, you know, chemicals.
Well, there are two interesting things about urine and dung, actually, which I will tell you about. Those of you who are grossed out can just kind of keep themselves on mute. There are many recipes which say place your vessel in dung to keep it warm. Now, you know, have your students do research on that. That is because dung is thermophilic. It hosts a thermophilic bacteria. And this thermophilic bacteria will keep the dung at a constant low temperature, about 70 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And so that means that it's the perfect way to keep a vessel warm, not too hot, but warm, lukewarm over a long period of time, because these bacteria are actually self-regulating, that if they get too high, they begin to die, and then it cools off, etc. So it was in fact you know, the way in which they could regulate heat, a natural way to regulate heat of you know, heating a vessel with some material in it. So that's the interesting thing about dung, and you know, that's a good chemistry lesson. That's a good biology lesson.
Yeah, exactly.
So urine. So this is very interesting that there are many, many recipes. I just saw a chat. There are many recipes that use urine as part of a making process, and we thought we'd like to try this out. But the thing is that most of those recipes say use old vinegar or old urine. So, you know, we thought, okay, vinegar is acidic and therefore urine must be acidic. But we never, even if we aged urine, we had many very gross experiments of aging urine. We could only work with our own. We couldn't share bodily fluids. But, so we found that we could never get urine that was acidic. And it was always pretty much neutral on the, you know, pH. And so we began to wonder, was there something in the early modern diet which made urine different? And so there you have a kind of environmental, ecological lesson of what actually, you know, how is a person's body influenced by what they eat and the environment in which they live. I still don't know the answer to this, so it's an open question for research, and I've asked so many biologists about this, and none of them do, you know, they say, well, we don't experiment on that kind of thing, but it would be very, very interesting to try to figure out, like, is it the small beer that everybody drank instead of water? Was it the fact that they ate a lot of meat or didn't eat a lot of meat? So, you know, there often these recipes specify only the urine of young boys before puberty, or only the urine of grown men. So maybe there's a difference there, which we could do, you know, you could do experiments on. I don't know whether you want to broach this to your students, but
well,
I mean,
everybody's families are home now, you know.
yeah, right.
Oh, honestly, I've been holding off at calling on
Right.
Jennifer with this inspiring conversation.
I hate to change the subject, but well, first of all, I now know that if I stick garlic clove in my ear, my toothache will go away. So that was pretty
Well,
exciting.
try it out. Yeah.
But I think what struck me both in your lecture and also looking at the videos that you suggested we look at as well. I had this personal experience with this concept in my own life, in that I had a grandmother who made amazing donuts. They were just like, we loved so much these donuts. And when she passed away, we had her little recipe book, and there was the recipe with no measurements. And then the description was just like, get the dough to this certain consistency. And we were all like, what the heck, you know? Mm-hmm. And my mom no one had made donuts with her because she was an independent lady. Mm-hmm. And so my niece decided, we're going to make these donuts. And we spent failure after failure attempting to figure out what is the correct measurements of these ingredients to be able to make the donut. And they never will be as good as hers. And then my other experiences with my husband's grandmother, his yaya, and we would make corombeades. And same thing, but what was interesting, she had ratios. So we didn't have measurements, but we had the ratios of the ingredients. And again, not even a description, but luckily, her daughter, my mother-in-law, had made them with her, and so she was able to tell me what the consistency. So when it feels like this was always what I was getting. When it feels like this, and so there was my expert practitioner, right? Who did that with me. But I think what was striking and how I could see this being used with students actually is this concept of failure. This idea, I love, like in one of the videos, one of your students said that you often say that failure is just a reason for further experimentation. And I thought for myself, we have to be able to give these opportunities to have, first of all, if I hand these kids, if I say, okay, look up this recipe that gives you no measurements and no real clear directions, I already can picture my high school students whining. How are we supposed to do this? Like, you know, and because they so are afraid of risking.
I know.
Right? Yeah. And so I love this idea of just being like, and so it could be, you know, I love that you talk about how you have your students do historical context. Like they have to go back and figure out like, where's the historical context for this recipe? So I think that's really awesome to challenge them, but I just love the idea of setting them up for failure.
Yeah.
And then saying, okay, now how do we fix this? What's the next step? Let's try this again. And really giving that life lesson in the context of this kind of historical connection that we can have to the past.
Yeah, no, I think that's one of the most powerful things actually that I learned about pedagogy. I mean, just first of all, how incredibly non-risk taking, how averse they are to risk. The college students, you know, I mean, they've succeeded in getting there, which means that they have tried to do everything perfectly, and they just can't believe that failure could ever be a good thing. But so, you know, the stakes are pretty low, right? They're cooking a historical recipe. And they'll get it that if they don't succeed the first time, they really want to try it again because they really want to get something. They want the product, even if it's really for us about the process. Somebody asked, I saw in chat, where is the recipe for bread, for early modern bread? So if you go to the Making Knowing website and you go to the components, I think it is, it's on the discussion section. You'll see our syllabi and you'll see our hands-on activities, the skill building activities, and the bread molding the bread baking activity has the recipe attached to it. If you can't get access to the files, the Google Doc files, for some reason, I can just email me. I'm happy to answer any questions. So,
Great.
yeah.
Well, in a few minutes, we're going to turn you over to the website. And we have a question still from Joan, and I think, Karima, you put your hand down?
Yeah.
You didn't?
Yes. Hi, I have okay. People can hear me. I have a question on a certain different aspect of this project, which I'm, is so inspiring and so relevant, and that is the relationship of making and knowing in the beginning of your lecture, you talk about how this project crosses different disciplines, and thinking a little more anthropologically about the connection of the brain and the hand.
Mm-hmm.
And what distinguishes humankind is that very connection of tool making and the technique, the elaborateness, what has this project, if anything, learned about how making is a kind of knowing, or enhances knowing, or leads to know? I mean, I'm just interested in that connection.
Well, I mean, historically, it led to what we call scientific knowing. So, that's connection number one for us. But obviously, in each person's experience, these are all college students. They've all been trained with text. They've all been trained, as we call it, a formal education in school using texts. And, it's only a few of the expert makers who have had an additional training, and I would say it's a very formal training of an apprenticeship. But the students come to see, they come to respect and understand how that is a formal training, and that it's a form of knowledge, being able to produce something over and over again, being able to observe closely, all of those kinds of things that we think of the scientific process or the scientific method. Those kinds of things are attained also through the formal education of an apprenticeship as well. So I think that the first step is humility in coming to understand what knowing is. And, it's a humbling experience for most of these students to actually go off and try these things and fail and so on. And then the next step is to feel like you have, even though it's just an exposure to the whole thing, a semester is just an exposure to making, they begin to see how they have some sort of mastery, some sort of accumulated experience that from which they can generalize about what's going to happen in an experiment, or in cooking, for example. That's exactly the kind of experience that, your grandmother had in donut making. It's not like she was born donut maker. She just did it many, 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 many times. So, I think that both as a historical lesson, as well as a kind of life lesson, that actually having the students work with their hands, not just read about craftspeople, which would be the alternative in college, but actually start doing this stuff with your hands, even if it's just simple stuff.
Thank
Well,
you.
this has just been wonderful, and I just wanted to add one thing. I've done something with my early world history students that back in the early eras. We do something we call a Neolithic picnic, in which I collect materials from nature centers and stuff like that, and put it out in front of the kids and say, what would you do with this stuff? And there's a set of questions they have to answer. What are the properties of this thing? What does it do? How could you transform this material? And Edmund Burke III, who worked with us on World History for Us All, in that thinking about the prehistory, developed this idea of toolkits. That humans develop toolkits from exploring matter, of finding its properties, finding its uses, putting things together. And he carries this all the way up to the idea of toolkits that accumulated over, the process of collective learning across the whole Eastern Hemisphere, and actually resulted in these technological complexes that are the foundation for modernity, for industrialization, for scientific revolution. Have you ever seen his article, Professor Smith?
No, I haven't.
I will definitely send it to you. It's magnificent.
Please do. Yeah.
It dovetails right into your work.
Yeah. Well, I think that you can really look at science. I'll just say one more thing in the last minute, but I think you can really understand science as just the latest instance of the human capacity for engaging with the material world. And, you know, that creates objects. Objects create rituals, create expert knowledge, create a hierarchy of experts. And that creates really a culture which values things. And so you can really follow those kinds of complexes. You know, you can follow the development of them from starting with the ways in which humans are interacting with the material world, you know, in a specific place. Led to bronze, it led to the making of bronze for a start, led to glass making, and so on. Led to cultivation, led to husbandry and crops, et cetera, et cetera. So you know, that led to the workshops. And in today's world, that kind of engagement with the material world, besides in agriculture and, you know, in manufacturing, is really done in the scientific laboratory. So you can really see, you know, that common thread at a kind of very high meta level, that common thread, that human capacity for engaging with the environment to produce things as, you know, structuring human culture.
Great. Well, thank you so much.